Her hands were bleeding when Gideon Mercer walked into his kitchen at 3 in the morning. Not a cut, not an accident. The kind of bleeding that comes from weeks of cracked skin split open again and again by cold water and hard work and no rest. She didn't stop kneading. She didn't flinch. She looked up at the richest man in Dry Creek the way a woman looks at someone she has already decided cannot break her, and kept working. Gideon had come down expecting a thief. He found something that would cost him far more than stolen money. If this story already has its hands around your heart, subscribe to this channel right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far Becca Hale's story travels. Stay with me all the way to the end. You will not regret it. Her hands were bleeding, and she hadn't stopped moving. That was the first thing Gideon registered, not the flour. Not the hour, not the unfamiliar figure standing at his bread trough in the dark. The bleeding. Both hands cracked across the knuckles, split in 2 places on the right, the kind of damage that accumulates over weeks when a person works without stopping and the cold gets into every small wound and pries it wider. She had her sleeves pushed to the elbows, and she was driving her fists into a mound of dough large enough to feed an army. And she had not stopped when the kitchen door opened, and she had not stopped when he held the lantern up. And she did not stop now. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Who are you?" he said. Not a question. Gideon Mercer hadn't asked a genuine question in the tone of a question in 30 years. Things came out of his mouth as statements, because in his experience, that was the form most likely to produce a direct answer. "Rebecca Hale," she said. "Ruth Hale's daughter." She went back to the dough. He stepped inside. He was 64 years old with a war wound in his left leg that complained in the cold, and a temper that he had mostly learned to keep banked. And he had walked into this kitchen prepared for almost anything: a thief, a drifter, one of his hands doing something stupid, but not this. Not a young woman in a work dress white with flour, with blood on her hands, kneading bread for 40 men at 3 in the morning, like she'd been doing it all her life. Because he was beginning to understand she had been. "Where is your mother?" he said. Something moved behind her eyes. "Quick. Gone fever," she said. "She asked me to finish the morning bread. I didn't want the hands to go without. A fever." "Yes, sir." He walked closer. Not to crowd her. He was not a man who needed physical space to make a point, but because something in that single-syllable answer had the texture of a thing that had been rehearsed. He had heard enough rehearsed answers in his life to recognize the particular flatness of them. He looked at her hands. "Those cracks aren't from tonight," he said. "Cold weather dries the skin. Miss Hale." He said it the way a man says a name when he is done with the current version of a conversation. "Those cracks are weeks old." She pressed her lips together and said nothing. "How long has your mother been sick?" "I told you." How long?" The dough absorbed 2 more strikes before she answered. 4 months, she said. Quiet. The words came out like something she'd been holding back with both hands and had finally let go of. 4 months. She didn't want anyone to know. She was afraid if you found out she couldn't keep up, you'd replace her, and then we'd lose the cottage. Gideon was still. "The cottage," he said. "It's our home." She didn't look at him when she said it. She kept her eyes on the dough. "It has been our home for 11 years. My mother has worked in this kitchen for 11 years without missing a day, without asking for more than what was agreed, without a single complaint. And now she is sick and frightened, and I will not stand by and let her lose everything she has built, because her lungs had to fail her this winter." The kitchen held the silence between them. "So you've been covering for her," he said. "Someone had to, for 4 months. "Yes, mornings and evenings, and whenever else it was needed." He pulled a stool from under the preparation table and sat on it. She glanced at him, surprised, he thought, that he hadn't simply walked back out. He set the lantern on the shelf and looked at the preparation table properly for the first time. There was a worn leather satchel beside the flour barrel. Buckled, but the flap was lifting at one corner, and he could see the edge of paper underneath formal stationery. The kind that came from somewhere institutional. Beside the satchel was a small-bound ledger, its spine cracked from heavy use, and tucked against the wall, almost hidden behind the second flour sack, a second larger ledger that he did not recognize. He reached for the satchel. "That's mine," she said immediately. "I can see that." He opened the flap, looking at it anyway. She made a sound that was almost not quite an objection. Then she went back to the dough. He turned the contents out carefully. 2 arithmetic volumes, studied nearly to pieces. The formal letter he'd glimpsed, he unfolded it far enough to see the letterhead. Meridian Teachers Institute, Helena, Montana. He folded it again without reading further and set it aside. A bundle of correspondence tied with kitchen string. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a square of calico cloth, something flat and hard that he set aside without unwrapping. Then he picked up the small ledger. He opened it to the first page. He turned 3 pages, then 5. Then he went back to the beginning and started again more slowly. The columns were dated back 6 weeks. They were labeled in a hand so precise it looked almost typeset dates. Vendors, authorized amounts, actual delivery quantities. Price per unit comparisons, cumulative discrepancies. She had flagged certain entries with a small mark in the margin. He counted 11 flags in the first 10 pages. He looked up. "These are my ranch's supply accounts," he said. "Yes. You've been auditing my supply accounts. Someone had to do that." 2. He looked back at the ledger. The flagged entries were not random. They clustered around specific vendor authorizations. Specific categories: feed, flour, lumber supplies. The discrepancies on any individual entry were small. Across 6 weeks, they were not small at all. "Who authorized these purchases?" he said. He already knew. He wanted to hear her say it. "The same signature on every flagged line," she said. V. Pike, his business manager, efficient, organized, detail-oriented. The man Gideon trusted to handle everything he didn't have time to handle himself. "How long has this been going on?" Gideon said. "Based on the patterns I can trace, at least 14 months. She didn't pause in her work. "Probably longer. I only had access to the records going back 14 months. And you said nothing." "I had nothing to say it with." She turned to look at him directly for the first time since he'd sat down. "I am not an employee of this ranch. I am the housekeeper's daughter, doing unpaid work in your kitchen in the middle of the night. If I had walked into your office 6 weeks ago with a half-formed suspicion and no proof, what would have happened?" He didn't answer. "You would have thanked me," she said. "You would have shown me the door. And Pike would have had time to cover everything before anyone looked closely. So I waited until I had enough that it could not be explained away." She turned back to the dough. "I was going to come to you this week. I was waiting for one more delivery record to confirm the November numbers." Gideon set the ledger down. He looked at this woman, 27 years old, flour in her hair, blood on her hands, working at 3 in the morning to protect her mother's job while simultaneously documenting what looked like 14 months of systematic theft from his ranch accounts, and felt something shift in his chest. Not pity. Something with more edges than pity. "Sit down," he said. "The bread can rest for 10 minutes. He waited. "That wasn't a suggestion, Miss Hale." She wiped her hands on her apron and sat. She kept her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at him the way a woman looks at a man she has decided to be honest with because she's too tired for anything else. "The letter," he said. "In your satchel, Meridian Teachers Institute." Her expression didn't change. But something behind it did. "What about it?" she said. "Were you accepted?" A long pause. "When?" "March." "It was October." 7 months ago." He looked at the kitchen around them, the enormous trough, the shaped loaves covered on the far table, the cracked hands resting in her lap, and understood without being told what had happened in the 7 months between March and now. "Your mother got sick," he said. "I made a choice," she said. Flat. Final. The voice of someone who has had this conversation with themselves 1,000 times and does not need to have it with anyone else. "It was my choice to make. I don't need anyone's sympathy about it. I wasn't offering sympathy. Good. She met his eyes. Because I don't want it. They sat in the quiet kitchen, and the cold pressed at the walls, and somewhere outside a horse shifted in the stable, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Why did you bring the ledger here tonight? He said. I bring it everywhere. I can't leave it at home if someone connected to Pike found it before I was ready to act. It would disappear. She paused. I carry it in the satchel, and I keep the satchel where I can see it. You've been carrying evidence of a theft against this ranch around Dry Creek for 6 weeks. Yes, that's either very brave or very foolish. Probably both, she said. Most necessary things are. He almost smiled. He didn't. But it was close, he said. She blinked. The bread isn't I'll see to the bread. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite trust and not quite suspicion, something in between. The expression of a person who has been surprised by kindness enough times to know that surprise is the correct response. She stood, reached for the satchel. Leave the ledger, he said. She stopped. Her hand rested on the satchel flap. He watched her think, watched the calculation move through her face. The weighing of risk against necessity, the particular arithmetic of a woman who has learned to run those numbers fast. Then she removed the ledger and set it on the table. She put on her coat. She picked up the satchel with the calico-wrapped photograph. Still inside it, she had forgotten it was there. He could tell, because when her hand found it, she paused almost imperceptibly before pulling the satchel close. She walked to the kitchen door. Then she stopped. She didn't turn around. She stood with her back to him and her hand on the doorframe, and she said it quietly. To the dark outside rather than to him, as if she had been turning the words over for so long that saying them aloud was almost incidental. Please don't punish my mother. Whatever wasn't finished, whatever hasn't been right for the past 4 months, that was me. I made those decisions. She asked me not to say anything, and I didn't. And if anyone answers for it, it should be me. She waited 1 beat. 2. Then she walked out into the Montana dark and the door swung shut behind her. Gideon sat in the empty kitchen and did not move for a long time. The lantern burned. The shaped loaves sat covered on the far table. The ledger lay open on the preparation surface where he'd left it. 11 small margin flags visible from where he sat. He got up. He went to the storeroom and found the tin of lanolin the kitchen staff kept for their hands in the dry months. He brought it back and set it on the table where she'd been working. She wouldn't see it tonight. He wasn't sure why he did it anyway. Then he sat back down and picked up the ledger and began to read. He read for 2 hours. He cross-referenced 3 times against the supply invoices in his office desk. The ones Pike brought him summarized each month neat. Organized exactly what a busy man wanted to see. The summaries were accurate. They were also, he understood now, accurate summaries of falsified source documents. The falsification wasn't in the summary. It was upstream. In the original invoices, in the vendor records, in the delivery confirmations. You would never catch it if you only read the summary. He had only ever read the summary. By the time the first gray touched the windows, he had counted 23 flagged discrepancies. He had traced the pattern back 14 months. Then back further through older records he pulled from the filing cabinet himself, and found threads going back further still. He sat at the kitchen table, with paper spread across the preparation surface, and the beginnings of something that looked very much like a case, and he thought about the woman who had built it from a kitchen stool at midnight. He thought about what she had said. I was going to come to you this week. She had been coming to him. She had been building this. Carefully, thoroughly, without access to the records a proper accountant would have had. Working from partial information and delivery logs and feed tallies. And she had built something that held together, something that would hold up. He set down his pen. The hands would be up soon. He could hear the first stirrings from the bunkhouse boot heels on board floors. The low exchange of voices that happened every morning before the cold fully woke anyone up. He went to the trough and looked at the remaining dough. He hadn't baked bread in 30 years. His hands knew the shape of it anyway, muscle memory from before the ranch. Before the war, from a farmhouse kitchen in Illinois, when he was young enough that nobody thought twice about a boy learning to bake. He rolled his sleeves and started working. It was 20 minutes before the kitchen door opened, and Caleb Voss appeared in the frame. Caleb was 35, lean and dark-eyed and constitutionally incapable of being rattled. He looked at Gideon's rolled sleeves and floured hands and said nothing. Because Caleb Voss had the rare quality of understanding when silence was the correct response. "Shut the door," Gideon said. "It's cold." Caleb shut the door. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and leaned against the wall and waited. "Ruth Hale," Gideon said. "Yeah. Since August." "Best I can tell." Caleb wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Maybe before she hit it well," I figured. He didn't apologize for it. "She's a proud woman. Didn't seem like my place to push. And Becca." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "She's been covering mornings for 2 months that I know of." "Probably longer." He looked at his coffee. "Good woman. Catches numbers faster than anyone on this ranch. I've been having her go over the feed tallies." Gideon shaped the last loaf without looking up. "Paying her? Fair rate. And the errors she found." Caleb looked at him. "You know about those. I know whose authorization was on everyone." Gideon set the loaf with the others and straightened up. "I need you to get me the original delivery confirmations for every feed shipment since last September. Not the summaries, the original confirmations." "How soon, Noon?" Caleb nodded once and set his cup down and left without another word. Gideon washed his hands and stood at the sink and looked out the window at the cold Montana morning and thought about a woman carrying stolen evidence around a cattle town for 6 weeks in a worn leather satchel. He thought about a Teachers Institute letter folded at the bottom of the same bag. He thought about the particular shape of a sacrifice nobody had asked for, and nobody had noticed, and nobody had even known to say thank you for. He dried his hands. He had 2 letters to write before noon. One to Dr. Garnett in Dry Creek, one to his solicitor in Helena. He would write them before he did anything else, because some things had waited long enough already, and a man who truly understood that did not let them wait one day more. He picked up the calico-wrapped object he'd set aside earlier and unwrapped it slowly. A photograph, old wartime from the uniform. Young black soldier standing straight, hand at his side, looking directly into the camera with eyes that were formal and fully. Unmistakably alive, the kind of eyes that looked at something enormous and didn't look away. Gideon had seen those eyes before, not in this photograph. He stood very still. The kitchen warmed around him as the stove worked, and the loaves sat and the morning came on outside the windows. He stood still and looked at the face of the young soldier and listened to a voice he hadn't heard in 35 years say something to him, across all that silence and all that distance. "If you get another life after today, Mercer, make it useful to somebody besides yourself." He had gotten another life. He had built a cattle empire. He had employed 40 men. He had acquired land and cattle and a reputation in 3 counties. He had done all the things the world agreed constituted a life well used. He had not known his housekeeper was sick. He had not known her daughter had been holding everything together alone. He had not known, had never thought to ask what was happening to the people who built this ranch with him every single day. The photograph didn't shake in his hand, but his hand knew it should. He set it down carefully on the table, face up, so that Amos Hale's direct and living eyes looked up at the kitchen ceiling of the empire one man had survived long enough to build. He put on his coat and his hat and went to write his letters. Across Dry Creek, in a small cottage at the edge of the Red Willow property line. Nobody yet knew that something had broken open in the night, that a man who had built 40 years of wealth and distance had sat alone in his kitchen and finally started asking the right questions. Nobody knew. But 3 people were about to find out that the woman everyone had overlooked had already changed everything. They just didn't know it yet, and neither fully did she. The letters went out before sunrise. Gideon handed them to the stable boy personally. Told him to ride hard for Dry Creek and not stop for anything that wasn't on fire. And watched the horse disappear down the dark road before he went back inside. He didn't feel like a man who had done something decisive. He felt like a man who had spent 40 years being decisive about cattle and land and money, and had apparently never once applied that same instinct to the human beings standing right next to him. That feeling did not sit comfortably. He didn't try to make it comfortable. He had work to do. By the time Caleb appeared with the original delivery confirmations 2 hours before noon, ahead of schedule, because Caleb operated that way, Gideon had his office desk cleared, and the supply ledgers from the past 18 months stacked in order along the wall. Caleb dropped the confirmations on the desk, pulled up a chair without being invited, and waited. "You've looked at these," Gideon said. "Looked at enough of them. Tell me what you see." Caleb leaned forward and pulled 3 confirmations from the stack. He laid them side by side, these 3. Feed delivery from Haverstock suppliers. September through November of last year. Invoices show delivery of 250 bushels each month. Confirmation slips show 210. 40 bushels a month, short on the delivery. Full price paid. Caleb laid 2 more papers alongside. Then here, lumber order from Crane Brothers in March. Invoice shows 1,600 board feet. Actual delivery, he tapped the confirmation. 1,100. 500 board feet invoiced and paid for that never arrived. Gideon looked at the papers. "And the authorization on every invoice." "V. Pike," Caleb said. "Every single one." The office was quiet. "He's been doing this for at least 14 months, Gideon said. "Longer, probably. This is just as far back as Becca could trace with what she had access to." Gideon looked up. "You knew she was tracking this." Caleb met his eyes. "I knew she'd found some things. She didn't tell me the full picture. Said she wanted to be certain before she said anything to anyone." He paused. "She was being careful. Smart careful, not scared careful. There's a difference, big one." Caleb straightened the papers. "Scared careful means you stall because you don't know what to do. Smart careful means you wait until nobody can argue with what you've got." Gideon looked at the stack of confirmations. 14 months of small thefts, each one slight enough to disappear into the normal variance of running a large operation. Each one authorized by the man he had trusted to manage what he didn't have time to manage himself. The total, when he'd run the numbers at 3 in the morning, came to something north of $4,000. He'd had employees steal from him before. It happened. He dealt with it and moved on. What he couldn't move past was the particular machinery of this theft, the fact that Pike had clearly understood exactly how it worked. Which records to falsify, which authorizations to use, and had banked on the reasonable certainty that nobody was looking closely enough to catch him. He had been right. For 14 months he had been completely right. Nobody had been looking, except one woman with a kitchen stool and a cracked ledger and hours she didn't have to spare. "I need to speak with her," Gideon said. Caleb nodded and stood. "Not here," Gideon said. "I don't want Pike seeing her walk into my office." "Is she in town today?" "Should be. She keeps books for Alderman's Feed on Tuesday mornings. Then send word to her there." Carefully, Caleb put on his hat and left. Gideon sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about Vernon Pike, who would be riding in from his house at the edge of town sometime in the next 2 hours. Walking into this office with his usual self-contained efficiency, expecting a normal Tuesday at Red Willow Ranch. He thought about how many normal Tuesdays Pike had sat across this desk while $4,000 of stolen money sat somewhere Gideon didn't know about. He kept his expression steady when Pike arrived at 9:30. He was good at that. Pike was a compact man, 47, with a habit of carrying a leather portfolio everywhere he went, and a manner of speaking that gave everything the texture of a concluded matter. He had worked for Gideon for 6 years. He handled vendor negotiations, supply contracts, expense authorizations, and the monthly financial summaries that Gideon reviewed over breakfast and signed off on. He was efficient, thorough, Indispensable, Gideon had always thought. He came in, sat down, opened the portfolio. Morning. I have the October summary ready for your review. Feed costs came in slightly above projection. But I've already negotiated a better rate for November from Haverstock. Leave the summary, Gideon said. I'll look at it later. I want to talk about the Crane Brothers lumber account. Pike didn't blink. March order. Came in as specified. 1,600 board feet. He turned a page in the portfolio. I can pull the invoice if you need it. I have the invoice. Gideon kept his voice even. I also have the delivery confirmation. I'd like you to explain the difference between the two. The first pause. Very short. Very controlled. Deliveries sometimes vary from the invoice at point of unloading, Pike said. Lumber gets miscounted in transit. Standard practice is to pay the invoiced amount and reconcile at the next order. 11 months later, and it hasn't been reconciled. I've been tracking it. I intended to apply a credit to the December order. That's good to hear, Gideon said pleasantly. He laced his fingers together on the desk. I'd like you to do the same for the Haverstock feed deliveries. September, October, November of last year. The confirmations show we paid for 40 bushels a month that were never delivered. The second pause was longer. I'll need to look into those records, Pike said. I already have, Gideon said. Take your time. Something shifted in Pike's expression. It didn't show on his face, the man was too practiced for that, but it showed in the way he closed the portfolio. Slowly, carefully, like a person who is buying himself seconds to think. I can have a reconciliation prepared by end of week, Pike said. That would be fine, Gideon said. In the meantime, I'd like you to hold off on authorizing any new supply orders until we've finished the review. A breath. Controlled, of course. Thank you, Vernon. Pike stood. He gathered the portfolio and walked to the door with his usual measured step. And Gideon watched him go and kept his face entirely neutral until the door closed. Then he picked up his pen and began writing a third letter. This one to the county sheriff in Helena. He was going to need to move faster than end of week. Becca Hale arrived at Red Willow Ranch at 2:30 in the afternoon. Caleb brought her through the back of the property, away from the main yard, and knocked twice on Gideon's office door before opening it. Becca came in with her coat buttoned and her satchel over one shoulder, and the particular expression of a woman who has been summoned to a place of power and has decided in advance that she will not be impressed by it. She looked at the delivery confirmations spread across the desk. She looked at Gideon. She did not look at the chair he gestured to. You've been through the records, she said. Sat up most of the night. And you were right. All of it. He leaned back. November numbers confirmed this morning. I estimate the total at just over $4,000. She absorbed that. I had it at $3,800. I didn't have access to the full vendor records. $3,800 and change. You were close. He watched her. You did very thorough work. I had a thorough reason. She set her satchel down and looked at the papers again. And he could see her doing the same thing he'd seen her do in the kitchen, running numbers. Checking, verifying, the mind moving faster than the expression showed. What happens now? I've written to the sheriff in Helena. I've asked Pike to hold off on new authorizations pending review. He paused. He knows something is happening. He doesn't know yet how much I know or where it came from. How long before he figures it out? Not long. He's not a stupid man. She looked at him steadily. Then we need to move before he does. Gideon almost smiled at we. Almost. That's what I intend. What do you need from me? For now. Nothing. I want you to stay away from Pike and stay away from the main yard. When the time comes for the accounting to be presented, I'll need your ledger and your testimony. But for my mother, she said. She said it the way a person says, the thing they have been holding back since they walked in the room. Has Dr. Garnett come yet? He's with her now, the composure cracked. Just briefly. Just enough. She looked at the window for a second, and her jaw moved, and then she looked back at him, and her voice was level again. What did he say? He hasn't finished his examination. He'll speak with me this evening. Gideon held her eyes. She will not lose the cottage, Miss Hale. I want you to understand that clearly. Whatever the diagnosis, whatever time she needs to recover, her position here is not in question. The silence that followed was the kind that means something landed harder than expected. You said that very easily, she said. For a man who employs 40 people and keeps his books by summary, I know how it sounds. Do you? Not accusing. Genuinely asking. Because it sounds like the kind of thing a man says when he's just found out something uncomfortable and wants to feel better about himself. Gideon was quiet for a moment. It might be, he said. I'm not going to argue with that. She looked at him. He looked back. My mother won't accept charity, she said. I'm not offering charity. I'm correcting an employment arrangement that should have included provision for illnesses from the beginning. That is different. She'll say it isn't. Then I'll say it is. And since I own the ranch and she works for it, my definition applies. He said it without arrogance, just the flat practicality of a man stating how things are. She earned that provision 11 times over. She simply never had it in writing because I was sloppy about people and precise about cattle. Becca was quiet for a long moment. You're going to have to say that to her yourself, she said. She won't believe it from me. She'll think I talked you into it. Then I'll say it to her myself. So am I. He picked up his pen. I've outlasted stubborn before. For the first time since she'd walked through the door. Something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile. But the shadow of one there and gone. She reached for her satchel. I'll leave the full ledger with you, she said. I made a copy last week. The copy is in a separate location. He looked up. You made a copy, in case something happened to the original. She pulled the ledger out and set it on the desk. Or to me. He looked at the ledger, then at her. You were concerned for your safety. Pike isn't a violent man, she said. But $4,000 changes what kind of man a person turns out to be. I didn't know how far he'd go if he found out someone was tracking him. She held his gaze. So I was careful. She had spent 6 weeks carrying evidence of a theft while quietly baking bread in the dark and keeping accounts in town and covering her sick mother's work. And she had been careful enough about all of it that nobody had known. Nobody had suspected, and the one person responsible had had no idea she was coming. Gideon thought about what Caleb had said. Smart, careful. Not scared, careful. Go home, he said. I'll send word when Garnett has finished. She nodded. She picked up the satchel and walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame, the same doorway posture as the kitchen the night before. The same quality of a person saying the last thing. Mr. Mercer, Miss Hale, the people on this ranch, she said. The hands, the kitchen staff, the stable crew. They work hard. They've always worked hard. She stopped. Seem to decide something. They just need someone to notice. She left. Gideon sat in the quiet office and looked at the ledger she had placed on his desk. He thought about 40 people who had been working hard and apparently hoping that the man at the top of the operation might eventually think to look in their direction. He thought about how long they had been hoping that. He picked up a fresh sheet of paper and began making a different kind of list. Dr. Garnett came back at 5 o'clock. He was a compact, precise man who had been the closest thing to a real physician within 40 miles of Dry Creek for 15 years. He sat down across from Gideon without taking off his coat, which was a habit he had when the news required efficiency. Respiratory illness, he said. Chronic. She's been managing symptoms for probably 6 to 8 months without treatment. The cold weather this fall has accelerated it. How serious? Serious enough that she shouldn't have been working at the level she's been working. He paused. Or any level, frankly. She needs rest, warmth, and a medicinal regimen I'll leave with instructions. With proper treatment and time, I believe she can substantially recover. Without it, he opened his hands. Without it, winter will make this considerably worse. Gideon nodded. What does she need? Rest, 6 weeks at minimum. Possibly through December. The medicine is straightforward. Not expensive. What costs more is the time. Garnett looked at him carefully. She's worried about her position. She told me 3 times that she was perfectly capable of managing her duties. I told her 3 times that she was wrong. She won't be losing her position. Garnett nodded once. That's what I assumed you'd say. I told her that too. What did she say? She didn't believe me. He stood. She'll need to hear it from you. Probably more than once. After Garnett left, Gideon put on his coat and walked across the property to the small employee cottage at the far edge of the yard. Ruth Hale answered the door herself. She was 52. And she looked both more and less than he expected, smaller than the self-contained presence she'd maintained in his kitchen for 11 years. And at the same time more vivid, more specific, more real than she'd ever seemed when he was looking past her to the next thing on his list. She had her daughter's jaw, and a sharper, narrower version of her daughter's eyes. And she was holding the door frame in a way that was meant to look casual and was clearly keeping her upright. Mr. Mercer, she said. Her voice was careful, prepared. Mrs. Hale. May I come in? She stepped back. The cottage was small and meticulously kept. There was a table with 2 chairs. A shelf of books, more books than he expected, a small cook stove burning steadily. On the table was an arithmetic problem, half worked out on a piece of paper. Becca's handwriting. The photograph he'd sent the kitchen was nowhere visible. He wondered where she kept it. He sat down. Ruth sat across from him. She folded her hands and looked at him with the particular expression of a woman, bracing for something she has been dreading for a long time. You're not going to dismiss me, he said. I want to be clear about that before anything else. She said nothing. Waiting. You're gonna rest. 6 weeks. Minimum Garnett's orders. Not mine, though I'm making them mine as well. Your wages continue. The cottage is yours for as long as you work for Red Willow Ranch, which I expect will be for quite some time after you've recovered. Ruth looked at him. Something moved through her face, a complicated thing. Not quite relief, not quite anger, somewhere between them. My daughter talked to you, she said. Your daughter showed me some accounting irregularities that I needed to see. She also told me, because I asked directly, that you'd been ill since summer. He held her gaze. I should have noticed before anyone told me. That's not on her. That's on me. She had no right. She had every right, he said quietly. She has the right of a daughter who watched her mother work herself sicker because she was frightened to ask for what she'd earned. He set his hat on the table. You earned sick leave, Mrs. Hale. You earned it 11 years ago on the first day you worked for this ranch. I failed to make that clear in writing, and I failed to demonstrate it in practice, and you paid for that failure with your health. I'm correcting it now. Ruth looked at the table. When she looked up, her eyes were dry. She was not a woman who cried in front of employers. Probably not in front of anyone. The baking, she said. The morning bread. The supply logs. Are being handled, he paused. By someone who turned out to be considerably better at it than I realized. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She was supposed to go to Helena, the Teachers' Institute. She had a letter, I know. She never told me she'd stayed. Ruth's voice shifted. Something cracked underneath it just slightly, the way ice cracks before it goes. I didn't know until 2 months ago. I found the letter in her things when I was having a worse day and I couldn't manage the stairs. She pressed her lips together. She never said a word. She just rearranged her whole life around mine and never said a word. Gideon sat quietly and let that settle. She's going to be angry that I spoke to you, Ruth said. Probably. She doesn't take help easily. No, he said. I noticed. She gets that from her grandfather. Ruth said it quietly. Almost to herself, he was the same way, stubborn about dignity. Stubborn about what he would and wouldn't accept from people who had more than he did. Gideon was very still. Your father. Even. Ruth looked at him. My father, Amos Hale. He died before I was old enough to really know him. My mother told me about him. She paused. He was a soldier. Union Army. He used to say that a man could survive almost anything as long as he didn't give away the part of himself that knew his own worth. She almost smiled. Becca got that too. Gideon looked at his hat on the table. Amos Hale's daughter was sitting across from him, 52 years old, and sick and frightened, and still holding her spine straight, because that was what Amos had left her. The part of himself that knew his own worth. He had spent 35 years looking for Amos Hale. He had found his family working in his kitchen. He said none of this. It wasn't the moment, and it wasn't the right way. There would be a time for that. This was not it. Rest, he said. Doctor's orders and mine both. I'll check in at the end of the week. He stood. He put his hat back on. He walked to the door. Mr. Mercer. He'd turned. Ruth was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, some calculation happening behind the careful stillness of her face. My daughter, she said. She has a way of making herself invisible. Of doing what needs doing and not asking for anything, and making sure nobody has cause to look at her too closely. A pause. It kept her safe. For a long time, it kept her safe. But it's become a habit that isn't good for her anymore. He looked at her. I'm telling you, Ruth said simply, because you're the one who went looking. Most people don't go looking. He nodded once, put on his hat, and walked back through the cold to the main house. The next morning, Caleb was waiting for him on the porch before sunrise. Pike didn't come home last night, Caleb said. Gideon stopped. What? His housekeeper sent word an hour ago. He packed a bag yesterday afternoon and told her he'd be back by supper. He wasn't. Caleb's voice was level, but underneath it was something sharp. His horse is gone from the livery. Nobody in Dry Creek saw which direction he rode. Gideon stared at him. He ran. Looks that way. He ran before the sheriff got here. Letter from Helena won't arrive until tomorrow earliest. Caleb met his eyes. He must have known you were closer to proving it than he thought. He moved fast. Gideon turned and went directly back to his office and wrote a second letter to the sheriff, urgent. Detailed, with dates and amounts, and the names of every vendor he could confirm was involved. He sent Caleb to write it to Helena personally and not wait for the post. Then he sat back and thought about the gap Pike's disappearance left. Not the money. Not even the legal question. The sheriff would handle that now. And Pike would be found. Men who ran in Montana in October didn't disappear cleanly. He would be found. The gap was in the ranch's operations. Supply contracts, vendor relationships, expense authorizations, everything Pike had handled for 6 years was now sitting unmanned. Gideon could manage it himself in the short term, but the ranch needed someone who could step into that role quickly. Who understood the accounts, who already knew the vendors and the numbers and the patterns well enough to catch the next problem before it became a $4,000 theft. He knew exactly one person who fit that description. He also knew that person was going to argue with him about it. He sent a message to Becca Hale at the feed merchants, where she kept books on Wednesday mornings, asking her to come to Red Willow Ranch at her convenience. She arrived at noon. She came in with her coat damp at the shoulders from a light morning rain, her satchel over one arm, and an expression that said she had been thinking about what the message might mean since the moment she received it. She sat down across from him and looked at the desk. The supply ledgers were spread out. The delivery confirmations were organized in 2 stacks, confirmed discrepancies on the left. Unresolved questions on the right. He ran, she said. Yesterday afternoon. I was afraid of that. She looked at the papers. He was too careful a man to let himself get cornered. When did he realize you were moving? Yesterday morning. I asked him to hold off on new authorizations. Gideon leaned forward. I was too slow. I should have moved the day before. But I wanted the documentation complete. It's my fault too, she said immediately. I should have come to you sooner. I kept waiting for the November numbers. We both moved at the speed we thought we had. He stopped her. Recrimination isn't useful. What's useful is what we do now. He looked at her steadily. I need someone to manage supply accounts and vendor relationships while I engage a permanent replacement. The role requires someone who knows the existing accounts, understands where the problems were buried, and can rebuild vendor relationships that may have been compromised. Becca was quiet. I'm asking you, he said. I heard you. You haven't answered. I'm thinking. She set her satchel on the floor and looked at the ledgers. What does the role pay? More than you're making across 3 jobs. That's not a number. He told her the number. She looked at him for a long moment. He had the sense she was checking it against some internal accounting of what was fair and what was charity dressed up as fairness. That's a real wage, she said. It's the wage the work is worth. He held her gaze. This is not charity, Miss Hale. This is an employment arrangement based on demonstrated competency. You have demonstrated more competency in this area than anyone on this ranch, including the man who just fled the county. She almost laughed. The sound was short and surprised and real. There's a condition, she said. I expected one. When I find a way to get to Helena, when I can manage the time and the money, this arrangement ends without argument. I do not give up the teaching certificate permanently. Agreed. And my mother's situation is formalized in writing. Paid sick leave. Clear terms. Nothing that can be taken away by whoever owns this ranch 50 years from now. I'll have my solicitor draw it up. And I set my own hours, she said. I keep my current clients in town until I've built enough here that I don't need them. Fair. She looked at him. He looked back. The negotiation had taken less than 4 minutes, and she had gotten everything she asked for. And they both knew it, and neither of them mentioned it. All right, she said. She put her hand on the nearest supply ledger and pulled it toward her. Tell me what you know about the Haverstock account. Because those numbers have been bothering me since September, and I think the problem goes back further than 14 months. Gideon told her. Caleb came back from Helena 3 days later, with word that the sheriff had received the letter and sent 2 deputies west on the most likely route toward Idaho. He also brought a note from the solicitor, confirming of the second letter, the one about Ruth's employment terms. Papers would be ready to sign within the week. On the afternoon of his return, Caleb found Becca at the preparation table in the main ranch office, surrounded by 2 years of vendor correspondence and a cup of coffee that had gone cold because she'd forgotten to drink it. She had covered 3 pages of her own paper, with cross-referenced numbers in the small, precise hand he'd seen before. And she was working through the Haverstock records with the focused intensity of someone solving a puzzle that had been irritating her for a long time. He poured her a fresh cup of coffee without saying anything and set it beside her. She looked up, then at the coffee, then back at him. Thank you, she said. How far back does it go, he said. 18 months on Haverstock. Possibly 22. She turned a page. Crane Brothers, I can only confirm back 12, but the pattern suggests longer. She paused. Pike was methodical. He built the system slowly and kept each individual discrepancy small enough to disappear. He understood that big thefts get caught. $100 a month doesn't look like anything, unless someone's looking at all of it. Unless someone's looking at all of it, she agreed. Caleb sat on the edge of the desk. He wasn't the kind of man who sat on desks, he stood. Mostly, or leaned, or occupied whatever space he was in, with the minimal physical presence of someone who had learned early that making yourself smaller was sometimes the most useful thing you could do. But he sat on the desk now, which meant he was settling in. Which meant he had something to say that wasn't about the accounts. You know you could have come to me, he said, when you first found the discrepancies. You could have come to me instead of carrying it alone for 6 weeks. She looked at him. Would you have believed me? Yes. Would you have known what to do with it? A pause. Probably would have gone straight to Gideon, which would have been 6 weeks too early with half the evidence. She turned another page. I needed time. I know. He looked at her. I'm not saying you were wrong to handle it the way you did. I'm saying you didn't have to carry it entirely alone. She was quiet for a moment. I'm used to carrying things alone, she said. Not self-pitying. Just accurate, the way she was accurate about everything, as a statement of a condition that existed. Not a complaint about it. I know that too, Caleb said. He picked up his coffee. Getting used to something doesn't mean it has to stay that way. She looked at him for a moment, that measuring look. The one she used when she was running numbers on something that wasn't numbers. He held her gaze and didn't look away and didn't make it smaller than it was. Then she looked back at the Haverstock records. There's an entry in October of last year, she said. I need a second set of eyes on it. The vendor name is slightly different from the standard notation. Might be a clerical error. Might be something else. He leaned over. Their shoulders were close enough that he could feel the warmth of her through his jacket. Neither of them moved away. Show me, he said. She showed him. They worked through the rest of the afternoon that way, two people in a quiet office. Building something careful and thorough from what had been broken. Close enough that the question between them was obvious and unhurried, and neither of them yet ready to say it out loud. Outside, the first real cold of the Montana autumn came down hard, and the ranch kept moving, and Ruth Hale rested in her cottage with Garnett's medicine on the table, and the knowledge that the cottage was hers. And somewhere on a western road, Vernon Pike rode fast toward a reckoning he had not moved quite fast enough to outrun. And at the preparation table in Gideon Mercer's office, the woman everyone had overlooked opened the October ledger and found the thread that would unravel everything Pike had built. She pulled on it. The October entry was a vendor name that didn't exist. Becca found it on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days into her new role. Buried in the middle of a quarterly supply reconciliation, so routine it should put anyone to sleep. She had almost missed it herself. Almost. The notation read Cowboy & Sons. Billings, a lumber supplier, according to the invoice, authorized for $480 in March of the previous year. She had cross-referenced every vendor on Gideon's approved list twice. Callaway & Sons appeared nowhere. She set her pen down. She went through the approved vendor registry again. Then the county business register Gideon kept in the bottom drawer. Then the correspondence files going back 3 years. Callaway & Sons did not exist. Pike had paid $480 to a company that had never existed, and he had buried it inside a quarterly reconciliation between two legitimate entries so unremarkable that a person reviewing the document would have moved past it in seconds. She sat very still for a moment. Then she started looking for more of them. By the time Caleb came in at 4 o'clock, she had found 6. 6 ghost vendors. 6 sets of invoices authorized by Vernon Pike and paid from Red Willow Ranch accounts to companies that existed on paper, only as names and mailing addresses she had checked against Gideon's correspondence files and found attached to nothing real. Total amount across the 6 $2,240. On top of the delivery discrepancy scheme she had already documented. She had the ledger open in front of her and 3 pages of her own notes beside it when Caleb walked in. He read her expression before he read the papers. What did you find? He had 2 systems, she said. The delivery scheme, short shipping goods, and pocketing the difference, that was the visible one. The one he expected someone might eventually find if they looked hard enough. She turned the ledger toward him. This is the one he expected nobody to find. Ghost vendors. Entirely fabricated companies collecting payment for work never performed. 6 of them that I can confirm going back at least 2 years. Caleb looked at the page. Then at her. Total? Combined with the delivery scheme. We're looking at closer to $6,200. He was quiet for a moment. That's not careless theft. No, she said, that's architecture. He built this piece by piece, kept the pieces small and separated, and put enough legitimate work between them that nobody would ever look at the whole picture. She tapped the ledger. He was planning to keep doing it. He wasn't building toward an exit. He was building toward permanence. Until you started looking. Until I started looking. She gathered her notes. I need to tell Gideon tonight. This changes the legal picture significantly. It changes more than the legal picture. Caleb set his hat on the table. $6,000 is enough for a criminal indictment. Not just a civil recovery. Where is he? Office. He's been in there since noon. She was halfway to the door when Caleb said her name. She turned. He was looking at her with that particular expression he sometimes had, direct, unhurried, like a man who has made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to let it be known. "You've been here 3 days," he said. "You've already found something it took the rest of us 2 years to miss." She looked at him evenly. Somebody just had to look. Becca. He said her name differently that time. Not the professional address. The other one, the one that meant he was setting down the foreman's hat for a minute. "That's not nothing. What you did. Not just this week. All of it." She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her chest moved. The way things move when you've been carrying a weight so long, you've forgotten what it feels like to have someone notice. "Don't make me cry in Gideon Mercer's office," she said. "I've been fighting for credibility in this building for 3 days, and I can't afford it." He almost smiled. "Fair enough." She went to find Gideon. Gideon listened without interrupting. That was one of the things she was learning about him. The man knew how to be quiet when quiet was what was needed. He sat behind his desk, and she laid the notes in front of him and walked him through each ghost vendor. And he turned the pages as she spoke, and his expression moved through recognition and calculation, and something that looked almost like fury, held at a careful distance. When she finished, he set the last page down. $6,200, he said, minimum. "I may find more." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then back at her. "He built this very carefully." He did. And he still ran. "He ran because he knew I was looking. Not because he knew how much I'd found." She paused. "If I'd been slower, or if he'd been a little more careful about what he said in your office Tuesday morning, he might have had another year." Gideon picked up his pen. "I'm going to write to the sheriff again tonight, with the ghost vendor documentation." He looked at her. "Will you sign the accounting as the source?" She considered that for exactly the time it took her to understand what it meant, signing her name to a formal legal document as the person who had uncovered the fraud. In a county where she was known as the housekeeper's large daughter, who kept books for small merchants on the side. "Yes," she said. "It may draw attention." "Good," she said. "Let it." She left him writing and walked back through the main yard in the early dark and was almost at the gate when she heard the voice behind her. "Miss Hale." She turned. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Denny, 18, who mostly worked the stable, was standing a few feet back with his hat in his hands and an expression of someone who has been building up to something. "I heard you're the one that found out about Pike," he said. "Where did you hear that?" "Word gets around." He twisted the hat brim. I wanted to say, my dad worked for Pike at his last outfit. Before he came here. There was some money missing there too. Nobody could prove it, and Pike left before anyone looked too close. I always wondered." He stopped. "I guess I just wanted to say thank you for looking." She looked at this 18-year-old boy who had carried that for however long, waiting for someone to look. "Your father lost money?" she asked. "Not much. Enough. Tell him to write down what he remembers," she said. "Dates, amounts, anything he can recall. Give it to me by end of week. It might help the sheriff build a fuller case." Denny stared at her. "Really?" "Yes." She pulled her coat closer. "Every piece helps." She walked home in the dark thinking about all the ways a thing can grow when nobody is looking at it, the slow accumulation of small wrongs. Each one easy to dismiss, until the total is something that would have been unthinkable at the start. She thought about all the people who had just hoped that eventually someone would look. 2 days later, Pike was found. A deputy located him at a boarding house in Missoula, 60 miles west, traveling under a variation of his own name that was barely a disguise. He had taken $3,000 in cash from a private account Gideon hadn't known existed, a secondary account Pike had set up through a Helena bank using Red Willow Ranch's name, and had apparently been moving slowly west. Stopped by weather not quite fast enough. The deputy brought him back to Dry Creek under arrest on Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, all of Dry Creek knew. By Thursday evening, something else had spread through the town, alongside the news about Pike, the story of who had found him out. Some version of it anyway. Versions in small towns are like everything else in small towns. They start roughly accurate and get adjusted by the time they reach the third person. The version Becca heard, secondhand from the woman who ran the dry goods store, was that some bookkeeper woman from the Hale place had been secretly investigating Pike for months and had handed Gideon Mercer a complete case tied up neat as a package. The version that reached the Red Willow Ranch hands was apparently more colorful. The version that reached the wrong ears was the one that mattered. She was in Alderman's feed store on Friday morning, settling the week's books when she heard the door open behind her and felt the quality of the silence change. She had grown up in a town small enough that she'd learned to read rooms from the back of her neck, and the back of her neck told her before she turned around that whatever had just walked in was not routine. 3 men. She recognized 2 of them, Harlan Bates, who ran the feed store supply contracts and had worked with Pike for years, and a lawyer named Whitmore from down the street, whose office shared a wall with the room where Pike had conducted most of his external business meetings. The third man she didn't know. Miss Hale, Whitmore said. He had a voice designed to fill rooms without raising itself. I wonder if we might have a word. Mr. Alderman had gone to the back. She was alone at the counter with a ledger open in front of her and 3 men between her and the door. About, she said, about the serious accusations being made against Mr. Pike. Whitmore stepped closer. I represent Mr. Pike's interests. I'd like to understand the nature and source of the accounting claims being attributed to you. I imagine Mr. Pike can explain his own accounting to the sheriff, she said. That conversation is already happening. The conversation that is happening, Whitmore said, is based primarily on documentation you compiled. Documentation assembled by a person who was not employed by Red Willow Ranch and had no authorized access to its financial records. She set her pen down. Mr. Mercer granted me access recently. After the fact of your investigation, he smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. It would appear, Miss Hale, that you were conducting an unauthorized review of private business records for a period of weeks before anyone at Red Willow Ranch sanctioned your involvement. That raises questions about the legality of the documentation. She looked at him. She looked at Harlan Bates, who was studying his boots. She looked at the third man, who was watching her with an expression that told her he was there to remember what she said. You brought a witness, she said, just a colleague, to a conversation you described as casual. She closed the ledger slowly. If you believe the documentation is inadmissible, Mr. Whitmore, I encourage you to raise that with the sheriff and Mr. Mercer's solicitor. That's the correct forum for legal questions. She picked up her pen and opened the ledger again. If you came here to suggest that I should reconsider my account of events, I'd ask you to leave. I have work to finish. Whitmore didn't move immediately. He let the pause extend a lawyer's technique, giving silence the weight of a threat. The situation could become difficult for you, he said. And for your mother. She looked up. She looked at him for a long time without saying anything. Get out of this store, she said. The words were quiet. The quality underneath them was not. Harlan Bates moved first. Stepping back, the third man followed. Whitmore held a moment longer, then turned and walked out. The bell above the door rang and went silent. Becca sat at the counter until her hands stopped shaking. Then she picked up the ledger and finished the column she had been working on. Because the numbers needed to be right, and because sitting still while her hands shook was not something she was willing to do for Vernon Pike or anyone who worked for him. Mr. Alderman came back from the stockroom 10 minutes later. Everything all right, he said, looking at the door. Yes, she said. Everything's fine. She rode to Red Willow Ranch that afternoon and told Gideon exactly what had happened. He listened to the whole thing without moving. When she finished, his expression was the one she had seen on him once before the banked fury. Held at distance. "Whitmore said your mother's name," he said. "Yes, specifically, yes." He stood up. He did it the way older men with old war wounds stand up when they've decided something carefully, and with complete intention. He picked up his hat. "Where are you going?" she said. "To speak with Whitmore." "Don't," she stood too. "If you go in there with that look on your face, you'll give him something to use. He'll say you're trying to intimidate a defense attorney. He'll make it about your behavior instead of Pike's." She looked at him steadily. "Let the solicitor handle it. That's what you're paying him for." Gideon stopped. He looked at her. "You just talked me out of doing something stupid," he said. "Someone had to." He put his hat back on, sat back down, and picked up the pen. "I'm writing to the solicitor tonight. And I'm writing a sworn statement that your access to the records was retroactively authorized, and that I personally requested your investigation on behalf of the ranch." He looked up. "I should have written that the first day. I'm sorry I didn't. It wouldn't have stopped him from trying." "No," he said. "But it would have made the trying harder." He started writing. "Go home. Stay away from Whitmore and stay away from Pike's associates. If anyone approaches you again about this, you come directly to me. I know you can handle yourself," he said. Without looking up, "I'm asking you to let me do something useful." For once, the last two words were quiet, and he said them to the paper. Not to her, but she heard them. She left him writing. She was at the gate when Caleb fell into step beside her. She hadn't seen him approach. She didn't ask how long he'd been there. "You heard," she said. "Enough." He walked beside her. "You all right?" "I'm fine, Becca." She stopped. He stopped beside her. "My hands shook," she said. After they left, "I finished the ledger column and my hands shook the whole time." "That's not weakness," he said. "That's what happens when you hold your ground in a situation that was designed to make you give it up." She looked at him. "You held your ground," he said. "In a room by yourself. 3 of them and 1 of you." The cold was coming down harder now. The end of October pressing its full weight against the afternoon. "He mentioned my mother." "I know. That's when I understood what kind of man Pike really is. Not the theft. The theft was greed, and greed is ordinary." She pressed her lips together. "Sending a lawyer to a woman alone to mention her sick mother. That's something different." "Yes," Caleb said. "It is." They stood in the cold and the silence stretched between them. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that means both people are thinking the same thing, and neither is quite ready to say it. "Walk you home," he said. "I know the way, I know you do." She looked at him. He looked back, and something shifted between them. Quietly and completely, the last careful distance between two people who have been circling something real and have finally run out of reasons to keep circling. "All right," she said. They walked. It was the first time they had simply walked together, with no particular purpose, no account to check. No delivery record to verify, no problem to solve. He matched her pace without comment. She didn't feel the need to fill the quiet. That itself was new. She had spent years making herself manageable in other people's presence, taking up less space, speaking efficiently, never asking for more attention than the task required. With Caleb, the quiet felt like something she was allowed to occupy. "My father was a ranch hand," Caleb said eventually. "Worked for other men his whole life. Good man, never owned an acre." A pause. "He used to say that the thing about working for someone else is that you're always one bad season. One bad owner, one bad decision away from losing everything. No matter how hard you work." Another pause. "I thought about that a lot when I came to work for Gideon. About how the people at the bottom of an operation are only as safe as the person at the top is decent." "And," she said. "And I think Gideon's decent," he said. "I think he got lost somewhere in the building of all this. Lost track of what it was for." He glanced at her. "I think you reminded him." She thought about that. about a man coming downstairs at 3 in the morning and finding something he hadn't known to look for. About letters written before sunrise. About the word replaceable and what it cost a person to live inside of it. I didn't set out to remind him of anything, she said. I just needed to keep my mother's home. I know, Caleb said. That's why it worked. The next morning was the one that changed everything. She arrived at Red Willow Ranch at 8 o'clock to find 3 horses she didn't recognize tied at the rail, and Gideon's voice coming through the closed office door with a carrying quality she hadn't heard from him before, not anger, but something that had grown out of anger and hardened. She went to the kitchen, where 2 of the ranch hands were eating late and listening with the focused attention of men who know something significant is happening nearby. What's going on? She said. The older one, a man named Cole, looked up. Sheriff's men came from Helena this morning. And Whitmore. And 3 of Pike's business contacts from the county. She set her satchel down. They're saying the case doesn't hold, Cole said. He looked at her directly. They're saying the accounting evidence was gathered by an unauthorized party and the whole thing falls apart without it. He paused. They're saying it was you that put it together and that you had a motive to lie because you wanted to secure your mother's position. The kitchen was quiet. She picked up her satchel. Where's Caleb? She said. Main barn. She went to the main. Caleb was there, doing nothing in particular, with a harness that didn't need attention, which meant he was waiting. He looked up when she walked in. Tell me what we're working with, she said. Whitmore filed a legal challenge this morning. Claims the documentation is inadmissible because it was gathered without authorization during the period before Gideon formally brought you on. He set the harness down. He's also filed a character challenge. Says you fabricated or misrepresented the accounts because you had personal interest in protecting your mother's employment. She breathed through that for a moment. What does Gideon's solicitor say? He says the authorization letter Gideon wrote retroactively is strong but not airtight. The other side will argue timing. Caleb looked at her. The cleaner evidence is the ghost vendors. Those don't depend on your authorization. Any accountant reviewing the records would find them. The problem is the delivery scheme. That's where your documentation is earliest. And that's where Whitmore will attack hardest. The delivery records, she said slowly. The original confirmations. What about them? I didn't find those. Caleb, you pulled those. You pulled those before Gideon formally brought me on. You're a ranch employee who had full authorization to access those records. She looked at him. Your testimony about the delivery discrepancies doesn't need me at all. He stared at her. I found the ghost vendors, she said. Those are clearly documented. You found the delivery discrepancies through your own authorized review of records I had flagged for your attention, which is a different thing from me making the case myself. She opened the satchel and pulled out her notes. If we separate the 2 strands of evidence and present them through 2 different sources, Whitmore's character attack on me damages only one strand. The other stands completely independently. Caleb took the notes from her. He read the top page, then the second. His expression moved through recognition and calculation, and something that might have been awe settled carefully into simple respect. You worked that out just now, he said. Walking from the kitchen, she took the notes back. I need to sit down with Gideon's solicitor this afternoon. Can you get me in? I'll get you in. They went in together. The solicitor was a careful man named Aldridge who had the habit of not showing surprise. He showed it now, briefly, when Becca laid out the evidentiary strategy in the first 3 minutes. Then his expression settled into something that looked very much like professional appreciation. She's right, he said to Gideon, who was standing by the window. Gideon looked at Becca. Walk me through it again. She walked him through it again. When she finished, Whitmore's challenge had 3 answers instead of 1. And the cleaner 2 of those answers had nothing to do with her credibility at all. We'll need Caleb's sworn statement by tomorrow, Aldridge said. You'll have it, Caleb said. and the Denny boy's father the testimony from Pike's previous employer. That goes to pattern of conduct. Whitmore won't be able to block all of it. I'll have that by tomorrow as well, Becca said. Aldridge looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man revising an assessment. Miss Hale, have you considered studying law? I'm studying teaching, she said. But I appreciate the thought. The hearing was set for the following Monday. On Saturday morning, Becca went to collect Denny's father's written account of the missing money from Pike's previous outfit. The man was gray-haired and nervous and apologetic in the way of men who have been waiting a long time for someone to listen. I wrote down what I could remember, he said. He handed her 3 pages in a hand that shook slightly with age. It wasn't much, $120 over 6 months. I could never prove it. You don't have to prove it, she said. You just have to remember it clearly and tell the truth about what you saw. She looked at the pages. The dates were careful. The details were specific. $120 might not be much on its own. But pattern of conduct across multiple employers was something else entirely. Will it help? He said. Yes, she said. It will. She was walking back to the ranch with the pages in her satchel when she heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to find Gideon Mercer on horseback, pulling up alongside her at a walk. She hadn't seen him on a horse before. He sat it the way men who grew up on horses sat them, completely naturally, as though the horse was simply a faster version of his own legs. He fell into step beside her without ceremony. You didn't have to walk, he said. I know. I could have had someone bring a horse. I like to walk. It helps me think. He was quiet for a moment. The satchel, he said. Denny's father? He rode slowly, matching her pace. I want to talk to you about something, all right. The confrontation in Alderman's store. He kept his eyes on the road. Whitmore threatened you. He used your mother's name. A pause. I know you told me to let the solicitor handle it. And I did, and that was the correct decision. But I want you to know that if anyone Whitmore, anyone connected to this business approaches you again in any way that feels like a threat, you tell me before you tell yourself to handle it alone. She looked up at him on the horse. Not because you can't handle it, he said. You've made it abundantly clear that you can. Because you shouldn't have to handle things alone just because you've gotten good at it. He paused. There's a difference between being capable of doing something alone and being required to. She was quiet for a moment. My mother said almost exactly that to me once, she said. About 2 years ago, when I was trying to manage something I should have asked for help with. Smart woman. The smartest I know. They walked in silence for a moment. The horse's hooves steady on the road. Mr. Mercer, she said. Gideon. She looked at him. You've been working here for 3 weeks, he said. I think you've earned the use of my name. Gideon. She tried it. It fit differently than she expected, less formal. Less distant, more like the name of a person than the name of a position. The photograph. The one in my satchel. He was very still on the horse. You recognized him, she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was level and careful. Why do you think that? Because of the way you looked at it that first morning. I came back for the satchel later that day, and the photograph was face up on the table. You'd unwrapped it and left it face up. She looked ahead. You didn't do that by accident. You did that because you'd been looking at it for a long time. He was quiet for a long time. Your grandfather saved my life, he said. The road stretched ahead of them, and the cold came down, and the words sat in the air between them like something that had been waiting 35 years for someone to say it out loud. She stopped walking. He pulled the horse to a halt. She looked up at him, and for the first time since she had walked into his kitchen at 3 a.m, she did not know what her face was doing. He went back for me, Gideon said. During the retreat, I was down in a field, and he came back through the smoke and carried me out. He looked at her steadily. I spent 15 years looking for him after the war. I couldn't find him. I didn't know. He stopped. I didn't know what happened to him. She looked at the road. He died poor, she said quietly. He came home from the war and there wasn't much waiting for him. He worked what work he could find. He died when my mother was 9, a pause. She grew up without him. I grew up without knowing much more than his name and a photograph my mother kept like it was the most valuable thing she owned. Because it was. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of 35 years, and 2 families, and all the ways history moves through people without their knowing it. I don't want you to think this changes what I owe you, she said. Her voice was steady, careful, the way she was careful about things that mattered most. The work I did for this ranch, what you pay me, my mother's position. None of that is about my grandfather. None of it should be. I know, he said. Because if it becomes about that, if it becomes about a debt to a dead man, then it stops being something I earned and starts being something I inherited. And I won't have that. She looked up at him. The gray-blue eyes were direct. Clear, unmistakably Amos Hale's eyes. Help us because we're worth helping. Not because you owe someone who isn't here anymore. He looked at her for a long time. I already know you're worth helping, he said. I've known it since about 4 o'clock in the morning on the first night. She held his gaze. But you're right, he said. The debt is separate. And I'll keep it that way. Then she kept walking. He walked the horse beside her the rest of the way to Red Willow Ranch, and neither of them said another word, and neither of them needed to. Because some things had just been said that had needed saying for 35 years. And the saying of them was enough for one October afternoon. Monday came. The hearing was not a trial. It was a formal review before a county justice, attended by Aldridge and Whitmore, and the sheriff's deputy and 4 of Pike's business associates, and half of Dry Creek, who had found reasons to be in the vicinity of the courthouse at 10 in the morning. Becca sat beside Aldridge. Whitmore stood and made his argument about unauthorized evidence, gathering with the smooth efficiency of a man who has made similar arguments before and expects them to land. Then Aldridge stood and presented Caleb's sworn statement about the delivery records. Then Denny's father's account of the previous theft. Then the ghost vendor documentation, which Becca had organized into a single clear exhibit that required no interpretation. 6 companies. 6 sets of invoices, 6 payment records, 0 existence in any county business registry or federal record. Whitmore objected. Aldridge answered. The justice read the exhibit. He read it for a long time. Then he set it down and looked at Vernon Pike, who was sitting at the side table in the same neat suit he'd worn to Gideon's office, and now looked considerably diminished inside it, and said, Mr. Pike, I'd like you to explain Calloway and Sons. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds was enough. Whitmore put his hand on Pike's arm and leaned close. But whatever he said arrived too late. Pike looked at the justice and then at Gideon Mercer, who was sitting in the second row behind Aldridge. And then his eyes moved to Becca and stayed there for a moment that she met without blinking. Then he looked at his own hands. I'd like to speak with my attorney, he said. The justice nodded. I think that would be wise. The hearing recessed for 20 minutes. When it resumed, Whitmore withdrew the challenge to the documentation. Pike entered an agreement to make full restitution and cooperate with the sheriff's formal investigation. The case moved out of the justice's hands and into the sheriff's, where it belonged. It was over in 37 minutes. In the corridor outside, one of Pike's business associates, a man named Foster, who Becca knew slightly from his supply contracts, walked past her and said, under his breath and without stopping, should have kept your nose in the kitchen. Sweetheart. She turned and watched him go. Caleb was beside her. His jaw tightened. Let it go, she said quietly. Becca, it doesn't matter. She watched Foster disappear around the corner. He said it because he lost. People say things like that when they lose. She picked up her satchel. It says everything about him and nothing about me. Caleb looked at her. She looked back. Still, she agreed. She straightened her coat. But it doesn't matter outside. Gideon was waiting on the courthouse steps. He looked at her when she came out, and his expression was not triumphant. It was something quieter and heavier than triumph, the look of a man who has just watched something be put right that should never have gone wrong. "Well done," he said. She looked at him. "We did that together." "No," he said. He was looking at the photograph he'd taken from his coat pocket, the calico-wrapped photograph she'd left in the satchel, and he'd apparently been carrying since she'd told him on the road. "We finished it together." He held it out to her. "You built it." She took the photograph. She held it for a moment, her grandfather's face looking up at her from decades away. Formal and fully alive. She put it in her satchel and walked down the courthouse steps into the cold Montana afternoon. And the town of Dry Creek watched a plus-size woman in a worn brown coat walk out of a courthouse, with her head up and her spine straight and her satchel over her shoulder. And some of them understood what they were seeing, and some of them didn't. And she walked the same either way. The ride back from Dry Creek was quiet. Gideon drove the wagon himself, which he hadn't done in years, usually left that to whoever was closest to the stable when he needed to go somewhere. But today he'd hitched the horses himself before the hearing and driven in alone. And now he drove back the same way, with Becca sitting beside him on the bench, and Caleb riding behind on his own horse, and the cold afternoon pressing down on all three of them. Nobody said much. There wasn't much that needed saying yet. The kind of thing that had just happened in that courthouse took some time to settle into the body before the mind knew what to do with it. Becca sat with her satchel in her lap and her eyes on the road, and Gideon drove and let the silence be what it was. It was Becca who broke it, about a mile from the ranch gate. "The workers," she said. Not preamble, not introduction, just the words. The way she said everything that mattered. The hands. The kitchen staff. Everyone who was here while Pike was running his schemes. Gideon kept his eyes on the road. What about them? They knew something was wrong. Some of them, Denny's father knew. Denny knew enough to tell me. She paused. "Cole told me last week that there were 3 hands who complained about supply shortages 2 winters ago, not enough feed for the cattle. Not enough flour in the kitchen, and when they brought it up, they were told the numbers were fine. The numbers were never fine. The supplies were being shorted, and the money was going somewhere else, and the people at the bottom of this operation were working harder to compensate for a shortage they were never told the reason for." Gideon was quiet. "They deserve to know what happened," she said. "Not the legal details. Just the truth. That the shortage was real. That it wasn't their imagination. That someone was stealing from them as surely as he was stealing from you." He pulled the reins slightly and looked at her. "You're right. I know I am. I'll speak to them tonight." She nodded and looked back at the road. He watched her for a moment, the straight spine, the calm hands on the satchel. The way she'd said "I know I am" without any self-consciousness at all. The way a person says a true thing when they've stopped needing other people to confirm it, and then he looked back at the road too and drove the rest of the way without speaking. He called the hands together in the main barn at 6 o'clock. All 40 of them came. The stable crew. Even Ruth Hale, who was still in her recovery period, but had apparently decided that whatever was happening in the main barn was worth the walk from the cottage. Because she came in quietly and stood at the back, with her coat buttoned and her hands folded and her face set in the particular expression of a woman who intends to hear everything. Gideon stood in the center of the barn and didn't use a crate or step to raise himself above anyone. He told them what Pike had done. He told them about the delivery shortages and what they meant, that the feed deficits 2 winters ago had been real. That the kitchen shortfalls had been real. That the workers who'd complained had been telling the truth and had been dismissed because the man responsible for answering their complaints was the same man responsible for creating the problem. He told them about the ghost vendors, the $6,000, the bank account in Helena. He told them Pike had been caught and would face full criminal proceedings. Then he said the thing that nobody had expected him to say. "The working conditions on this ranch are going to change," he said. "Starting this week. In writing. Any worker who is too ill to perform their duties will not lose their wages or their housing during the period of their illness. Up to 60 days, with extension at my discretion based on circumstances. Any injury sustained in the course of work on this ranch will be covered by the ranch doctor's fees. Medicine, recovery time. These are not favors. They are employment terms. They should have been in writing 11 years ago, and they weren't, and that is a failure of management that I intend to correct. The barn was very quiet. Cole, who had worked at Red Willow for 9 years, said, "You serious, Mr. Mercer? I'm having the papers drawn up tomorrow." Another silence. A different kind this time, the kind that settles over people when something they had stopped expecting arrives without warning. At the back of the barn, Ruth Hale pressed her fists together and looked at the wall, which was her version of being moved. Becca stood beside Caleb near the barn door and said nothing. Caleb leaned slightly toward her and said very quietly, "You did this." "He did this," she said just as quietly. "I just asked him to look." "There's a difference between being capable of doing something and actually doing it," Caleb said. "That's what you told me once." She looked at him. He looked back. "You're using my own words against me," she said. "They were good words," he said. Seemed like a waste not to. After the barn meeting, Gideon found her in the office. She was already at the desk. She hadn't even taken off her coat going through the supply contracts, with the concentrated focus of someone who has just watched a major problem get resolved and has immediately moved to the next one. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. "You don't have to do that tonight," he said. "The Haverstock contract renewal is due by Friday," she said. "The terms need to be renegotiated now that we have a full picture of what the previous agreement actually covered." She turned a page. "Also, I found 2 more vendor accounts this afternoon that need to be verified. I think they're legitimate, but I want to confirm before Friday's payment run." He came in and sat down across from her. She kept working. She looked up. "What you did today," he said. "In that courthouse. The way you organized the documentation, the evidentiary strategy you worked out with Aldridge that wasn't bookkeeping. It was accounting," she said. "Accounting tells a story with numbers. I just made sure the right story was being told. That's not a small thing." She agreed. "It isn't." He leaned forward. "I want to increase your wage." She put her pen down. "By 30%, he said. "Effective immediately. The work you're doing is not assistant bookkeeper work. It's not even head bookkeeper work. You restructured the evidentiary case for a criminal prosecution this morning, in the time it took most people to eat breakfast. The salary should reflect what the work actually is." She looked at him for a moment. He watched her run the same internal arithmetic she always ran, measuring what was being offered against what was fair, checking it for charity, dressed up as compensation. 30%, she said. 30%. That's a real wage. It's the wage the work is worth, he said. Which was exactly what he'd said before, and which they both recognized as the correct answer to the question she was actually asking. "All right," she said. She picked up her pen. "Then I'll finish these contracts tonight and have the Haver renegotiation ready by Thursday." He stood. "Go home, Becca. It'll keep until morning. I function better when the work is current," she said. Without looking up. "So do I," he said. "I'm still going home." He stopped at the door. "Ruth looked well tonight. Better than last week, doctor." Garnett came Tuesday. He says another 3 weeks and she should be able to return to light duties. A pause. "She's been driving herself half mad with the rest. She's not built for sitting still. Neither is her daughter," he said. She looked up. He was already gone. She sat for a moment in the empty office and listened to the sounds of their settling into the evening. She thought about the courthouse. She thought about Foster's voice in the corridor. "Should have kept your nose in the kitchen, sweetheart," and about the way she'd watched him go and felt the words slide off her rather than into her, which was new. She thought about what it meant that they slid off now when 6 months ago they would have found the soft places and stayed there. She thought about Caleb saying, "You did this in the barn." She went back to the Haverstock contract. 2 weeks passed. They were the most ordinary 2 weeks Becca had spent in years. Which was the strangest thing about them. She woke at a reasonable hour and ate breakfast and rode to Red Willow Ranch and did her work and rode home and slept. She did not need bread at 3 in the morning. She did not keep accounts for 3 separate businesses in the gaps between other obligations. She did not calculate, every week, whether the money would hold or whether she would have to find another piece of work to fill the gap. She had one job. It paid what it should pay. The numbers worked. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, and it didn't. What dropped instead was the letter from Meridian Teachers Institute. It arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded from the Dry Creek post office to the ranch because she'd updated her address when she started the new position. She found it on the preparation table in the office when she came in that morning. Her name on the envelope in the Institute's formal hand. She sat down, she opened it. It was from the admissions registrar. A woman named Mrs. Corbin, who had apparently followed up on Becca's March acceptance after receiving no response. The letter was formal and careful, the kind of careful that means the person writing it understands more than they are saying directly. Mrs. Corbin wrote that the March placement had been held open through the fall semester given the particular strength of Becca's recommendation materials. She wrote that the spring intake would begin in February. She wrote that if circumstances had changed and Miss Hale was now able to attend, the Institute would be glad to honor the original acceptance. She wrote that the Institute would be sorry to lose her permanently to other work. However valuable that work might be, Becca set the letter on the desk. She sat with it for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and began working on the morning's accounts. Because the accounts needed doing, and she needed to think, and she thought best when her hands were occupied. She was still thinking about it when Caleb came in at noon with the Haverstock delivery confirmation and set it on the desk and looked at the letter lying open beside the ledger. He didn't ask. "She's Helena," he said. The Institute held my acceptance. Spring intake. She turned the delivery confirmation over and checked the numbers against the invoice without really seeing them. "It's what I've been working toward since I was 19 years old." "I know," he said. She set the confirmation down. "It means leaving. 4 months. Minimum. Possibly 6, I know that too. The ranch at Gideon will manage," he said. "Or hire someone. The ranch existed before you got here." "It'll exist while you're gone." He paused. "That's not the question you're actually asking." She looked at him. He looked back. He had the patience of a man who has made decisions slowly his whole life and understood that the good ones couldn't be rushed. "What are you asking?" he said. She set the pen down. "I don't know how to leave something that finally feels like it's working," she said. "I have spent 8 years building toward a version of my life where the pieces fit together. And right now they fit. Right now my mother is safe. The work is real, the pay is fair," and she stopped. "And," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "And I don't want to lose what's here," she said, "whatever this is." She gestured slightly between herself and him. The 2 feet of office air between them that had been charged with something unspoken for 6 weeks. "I don't know what this is." "Yes, you do," he said. She looked at him. "I think you've known for a while," he said. "I think you've been waiting to see whether I'd ask you to choose between it and the things you've worked for." He pulled the chair from the wall and sat down so they were at eye level. Because Caleb Voss was a man who understood that some conversations needed to happen without anyone standing over anyone else. "I'm not going to ask you that. Go to Helena," he said. "Finish what you started when you were 19. Come back when it's done." He held her eyes. "I'll be here." She looked at him for a long time. "You say that like it's simple," she said. "It is simple," he said. "It's not easy. Those are different things." She picked up the letter. She looked at it again. She thought about the girl who had carried a Teachers Institute prospectus around for 2 years before she had the recommendation to apply. She thought about the woman who had folded the acceptance letter and carried it in the bottom of her satchel for 7 months without letting herself unfold it. She thought about her mother's voice saying he was stubborn about dignity and about what Amos Hale had left behind. The part of himself that knew his own worth. "I need to talk to Gideon," she said. "He already knows the letter came," Caleb said. She looked up. "How? He's Gideon Mercer. He knows everything that happens on this property within about 4 hours." A pause. "He was waiting to see what you'd do with it." She stood. She picked up the letter and the pen and closed the ledger. "Of course he was," she said, and went to find him. Gideon was on the porch, not waiting, exactly doing nothing specific, with a cup of coffee that had probably been in his hand longer than it should have been. He looked up when she came out. She held up the letter. He nodded once. "Sit down." She sat. February intake. "Yes, at minimum." He looked at his coffee. "I'll need someone on the supply accounts through winter. I can bring in a temporary bookkeeper from Helena for the period. It'll cost more and work less well." He looked up. "That's my problem to manage, not yours." "Gideon, you're not responsible for the gap your absence creates," he said. "You're responsible for the work you do while you're here. The rest is ranch management, and that is specifically my job." He set the coffee down. "You should go." She looked at him. "You should have gone in March," he said. "You didn't because you had reasons, and those reasons were good ones. The reasons are gone now." He held her eyes. "Your mother is safe. The cottage is hers, her wages continue through her recovery, and her position is secured in writing. You have 30% above your original wage, sitting in your account right now. Everything you stayed for is handled." He paused. "The only question is whether you're going to let yourself have the thing you wanted before all of this started." She was quiet. "I'm frightened," she said. It was the first time she had said that word out loud to anyone since this entire thing began. And the honesty of it surprised even her. "Of what?" he said. "That I'll go, and come back and find that what was here is different." She looked at her hands. "That I built something these past months, and leaving it means losing it." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The things worth having tend to wait for the people who go after what they need." He picked up his coffee. "That's been my experience, late in arriving but reliable." She looked at him. He was looking at the ranch, the yard, the barn, the cottage at the far edge of the property, where the curtain moved slightly in the kitchen window, which meant Ruth was up and moving around and feeling well enough to keep an eye on what was happening outside. "Write to Mrs. Corbin," he said. "Tell her you'll be there in February." She sat for another moment. Then she stood, folded the letter, put it in her coat pocket, and went back inside to write the reply. She told her mother that evening. Ruth was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the household account book open in front of her. She had been cleared for light duties the previous week and had immediately resumed the household accounts as though the preceding 6 weeks had been a personal affront that she intended to correct immediately. She looked up when Becca came in. Becca set the letter on the table. Ruth read it. She read it slowly, the way she read everything, once for information and once for meaning, because she had learned that those were not always the same pass. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. "February," Ruth said. "Yes, that's 4 months, I know, Mama." Ruth looked at the letter again. Then at her daughter. "And you're going." "I'm going." Ruth set the letter down carefully. "She did not say I should have told you to go in March. She did not say you gave up too much for me. Those were things that would sit between them like unpaid debts, accumulating interest, and Ruth Hale had not raised her daughter to trade in that currency. What she said was, 'I'm proud of you.' 3 words. Flat and absolute, the way Ruth said everything that mattered most. Becca sat down at the table. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. And the fire in the stove burned, and the cottage was warm, and outside Red Willow Ranch went about its evening business. And the 2 women who had built a life out of what other people considered insufficient materials sat together in the kitchen and let it be enough. The accounts, Ruth said eventually, for the ranch. While you're gone, Gideon's hiring a temporary bookkeeper. They won't do it as well as you. No, Becca agreed. Probably not. Ruth almost smiled. You sound like your grandfather. Everyone keeps saying that. It's the truest thing anyone can say about you. Ruth closed the account book. He would have been proud too. I want you to know that. He would have been. She stopped, pressed her lips together. Very proud. Becca reached across the table and put her hand over her mother's. They stayed like that for a moment. Then Ruth pulled her hand back and picked up her tea with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has had enough sentiment for one evening, and said, You'll need a new dress for Helena. That brown one is nearly done. The brown one is fine. The brown one is not fine. You're going to a teacher's institute, not a feed delivery. Ruth opened the account book again with the air of a woman who has already decided how this will go. I have enough set aside. Don't argue with me. Becca looked at her mother. I'm not arguing, she said. The weeks between November and February had a different quality than any weeks Becca could remember. She worked. She organized the supply accounts into a state that a temporary bookkeeper could maintain comprehensive notes, clear filing systems, annotated vendor histories, a reference document she spent 2 evenings writing that covered every active contract and every flag she'd identified in the existing records. She trained the temporary bookkeeper, a competent young man from Helena named Marsh, for 2 full weeks before she was satisfied that the accounts would survive her absence without disaster. She was thorough about it the way she was thorough about everything, not because she was required to be, but because she understood that how you left something mattered as much as what you built while you were there. Meanwhile, Caleb was present the way he was always present, steadily. Without announcement, at the edge of things in a way, was somehow never intrusive. He brought her coffee when it went cold. He checked the morning cattle tallies with her on days when the numbers needed a second set of eyes. He walked with her back from town on the evenings she worked late at Alderman's, winding down her remaining obligations there. He didn't talk about February. She didn't either, until one evening in late January, 3 weeks before she was due to leave, when they were walking back from town in the early dark, and the cold was settling hard and their breath made shapes in the air between them, and he said, without particular preamble, I've been thinking about something. What? She said. Whether you know what you mean to me. She kept walking. Her pace didn't change, but something in her chest did. Think I might have been unclear, he said, about how I feel. I'm not, he paused. She could hear him choosing words, which Caleb did rarely enough that when he did it mattered. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, but I'm also not a man who says things easily. And I want to be sure you go to Helena knowing certain things clearly rather than having to guess at them. She stopped. He stopped beside her. She turned and looked at him in the January dark. This man who had set a cup of coffee next to her without saying anything, and had walked beside her, and had said, I'll be here, as simply as he said everything true. Tell me, she said. I love you, he said. That's the certain thing. The rest of it, what it looks like, how it works. Where it goes, that's details, and the details can be figured out by people who are sure about the certain thing. He met her eyes. I'm sure. The dark held them both. I'm not easy to love, she said. I've been told that. By people who confuse difficult with complicated, he said. You're not difficult. You're precise. You know what you believe and you act on it, and you don't perform things for other people's comfort. He paused. That's not hard to love. That's the whole reason. She looked at him for a long moment. I've spent half my life, she said, waiting to see whether someone would eventually ask me to trade my future for their comfort. Whether the kindness would come with a price. She looked at his face, the dark eyes, the steady expression, the jaw that hadn't shifted since he started talking. You helped load my trunk instead. I haven't loaded it yet, he said. You leave in 3 weeks, I know. She looked at him. I love you too, Caleb, that's my certain thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully and without theater, He reached out and took her hand. She let him. They stood in the January dark on the road between Dry Creek and Red Willow Ranch. And the cold pressed down, and the stars were sharp overhead, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed saying. And after a while they started walking again, and his hand stayed around hers, and she didn't move it away. February came. The morning she left, the ranch was up early, not because she'd asked anyone to be, but because word had gotten around the way it always did. And it turned out that people who had watched a woman hold a courthouse together and reorganize an entire supply operation and write a training manual for her own replacement did not feel like sleeping through her departure. Cole was at the gate. Denny was at the stable. The kitchen staff came out in a cluster. Even the new bookkeeper, Marsh, stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and an expression of someone who fully understood that the annotated reference document she'd written him was the only thing standing between him and disaster. Ruth was at the wagon. She was straight-backed and dry-eyed and wearing her good coat, which meant this was a significant occasion. She had the new dress which she had sewn herself over 3 evenings. Gray wool, well cut, the kind of dress that said capable professional, without announcing it, packed carefully in the trunk beside Becca's books. She did not make a speech. She was not a woman who made speeches. She put both hands on Becca's face, looked at her for a long moment with those sharp eyes that had seen everything and survived most of it, and said, "Come back knowing you earned it." Becca covered her mother's hands with her own. "I will," she said. Gideon shook her hand at the wagon. Proper, formal, the handshake of a man conducting legitimate business with someone he respects. "The reference letters are in the trunk," he said. 3 of them. My solicitor, the county justice, and mine. She looked at him. "You wrote me a reference letter. I wrote you an accurate description of work performed," he said. "It happens to be complimentary because the work happened to be exceptional." He released her hand. "Don't embarrass me by performing anything less than what I described." "I won't," she said. He nodded, stepped back, put on his hat a way that meant the formal part was finished. Caleb loaded the trunk himself. He did it carefully and without ceremony. The way he did everything, and when it was secured, he came around to where she was standing and looked at her. "Right," he said. "All right," she said. "Not once a month." "Regularly," she agreed. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he stepped forward and did something he had never done in front of anyone. At the ranch, he put his arms around her. Carefully and completely, and held on for exactly as long as it meant something. She held on too. When he stepped back, his expression was the same as always, steady. Unhurried, entirely himself. But she knew him well enough now to read what was underneath it. And what was underneath it was everything he'd already said, in the dark on the January road. She climbed up onto the wagon. She picked up the reins. She looked at the people standing in the yard of Red Willow Ranch, 40 workers who had new employment terms in writing. A mother who had a safe home and a paid recovery, a man with steady eyes who had said, "I'll be here," and she understood. Fully and without sentimentality, that she was not leaving because she didn't belong here. She was leaving because she did. She clicked her tongue and the horse moved and Red Willow Ranch got smaller behind her, and she kept her eyes on the Helena Road and felt, for the first time, in as long as she could remember, that the future was a place she was choosing to go, rather than a place she was trying to survive reaching. That was new. She drove toward it. The letters came every 2 weeks without fail. Caleb knew her handwriting before he'd read the first line of the first one, the same precise. Dense hand she used on the ledgers, but looser here. More itself, like a person who had found a place where they didn't need to be economical about space. She wrote about the Institute, about the other women in her cohort, about a professor named Dr. Harlan who had the habit of calling on students mid-sentence to finish his own thoughts, which she found both irritating and effective. She wrote about Helena, the size of it, the noise of it, the particular way a city moves in winter, when everyone is cold and in a hurry, and pretending not to be. She wrote about what she was learning, She did not write about whether she was happy. She didn't have to. The letters themselves were the answer. They were the letters of a person who had found the place their mind had been reaching toward for a long time and had discovered that the reaching hadn't been wrong. Caleb wrote back. His letters were shorter. He was not a man built for long correspondence, but they were regular. And they were honest. And they said the things that needed saying without ornamentation. He wrote about the ranch, about the cattle numbers and the supply accounts, and how Marsh was managing adequately but had a habit of misfiling the vendor confirmations that was going to cause problems if it wasn't corrected. He wrote about Ruth, who had returned to full duties in March and had immediately reorganized the kitchen storage system in a way that nobody had asked for and everyone agreed was better. He wrote about Gideon, who had apparently decided that reforming the employment terms was not enough and had begun meeting with his hands individually to understand what they actually needed. He wrote, once, near the end of March, I think about the road in January, more than I probably should. He did not elaborate, he didn't need to. She wrote back, so do I. Spring came to Red Willow Ranch the way it always did in Montana, abruptly. Without apology, as though winter had simply decided it was done, and walked out. The mud season was brutal and the cattle work was relentless, and Gideon pushed himself harder than a 64-year-old man, with a war wound, probably should have. Which Caleb noted and said nothing about because Gideon Mercer was going to do what Gideon Mercer decided to do, and the trick was being nearby when it caught up with him. It caught up with him in April. Not dramatically, the man was too controlled for drama. He simply came in from a long day of fence inspection, looking gray around the edges, and sat down at the kitchen table and stayed there long enough that the cook came to find Caleb. Caleb found him still at the table. You're done for the day, Caleb said. The east fence is handled, Caleb said. I'll finish it. You're done. Gideon looked at him. Something in his expression, the particular exhaustion of a man who has been running on will for too long and has just felt the will run a little thin, acknowledged the truth of it. Getting old, Gideon said. You were old when I got here, Caleb said. Didn't stop you then. Something's different, Gideon said. He wasn't being dramatic about it either, just accurate. This year is different, since October. Caleb sat down across from him. Since October, you've handled a criminal prosecution, restructured your employment terms, hired and trained a replacement for a 6-year business manager, supervised a record cattle sale, and tried to run your own fence inspections in April mud. He paused. Something's different, because you're actually paying attention to what's happening here. It's more work than you were doing before. Gideon was quiet. It's better work, Caleb said. Gideon looked at the table. She used to say that, about the difference between doing a lot and doing something worth doing. She still says it. In the letters, Gideon looked up. She writes to you. Every 2 weeks. Something moved through the older man's expression, not quite a smile. But what a smile leaves behind when the person is too tired and too private to let it fully form. Good, he said. He pushed himself up from the table. The east fence is handled, Caleb said again. This time Gideon let it go. He went to bed before dark, which neither of them mentioned to anyone. In June, the letter came that was different from the others. Caleb recognized it before he opened it. The handwriting was the same, but the envelope was thicker. Which meant she'd written more, which meant something had happened worth writing more about. He opened it at the preparation table in the ranch office, where she'd spent her first weeks building the fraud case, because that felt like the right place. She'd been asked to teach. Not formally, not yet. One of the Institute's senior students had fallen ill in April, and the cohort fell behind on basic arithmetic instruction for the younger girls in a demonstration school attached to the Institute. Dr. Harlan had asked Becca, without particular preamble, if she'd be willing to step in for 2 weeks while the student recovered. She had been teaching for 2 months now. Dr. Harlan had apparently stopped calling it temporary after the first week. She wrote, I didn't know it would feel like this. I knew I wanted it. I didn't know it would feel like the first time something I was doing on the outside matched what I'd been doing on the inside my whole life. I teach a girl named Clara who couldn't add past 10 when I started, and last week she worked a 3-column sum without help and looked up at me with an expression I cannot describe except to say that I understood at that exact moment why people do this work for their whole lives. Caleb read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and went out to check the cattle numbers. And when Cole asked him at noon why he was in such a good mood, he said the numbers were better than projected. Which was true and not the whole truth. Summer moved through the ranch the way summer did, long and hot and relentless and full of the particular satisfactions of outdoor work in good weather. The cattle sale in July was the strongest Red Willow had seen in 5 years. Gideon credited the supply account reforms, which had eliminated $6,000 of annual losses at a stroke. Caleb credited Gideon's direct engagement with the hands, which had produced a workforce that was working harder because they understood they were being treated fairly. Neither of them mentioned Becca out loud, but both of them were thinking it. Ruth noticed. She noticed everything. "You're both being very careful not to say her name," she said to Gideon one afternoon in August, setting his coffee on the office desk without being asked because she'd been doing it for 12 years and saw no reason to stop. "It's conspicuous." Gideon looked up from the correspondence he was reviewing. "I mention her regularly. In context of the ranch accounts," Ruth said. "Not of people who are waiting for something." He looked at her. She looked back with the expression of a woman who has been reading rooms for 52 years and finds this particular one very easy. "She's almost finished," Ruth said. "September. That's what her last letter said." "I know," Gideon said. "She wrote to me as well." Ruth raised her eyebrows slightly. "Did she?" "About the school," he said. "The one near Dry Creek." "She has a proposal." Ruth stood very still. "She found a building available for lease in October," Gideon said. 3 rooms. She wants to establish a school for ranch workers' daughters. Immigrant families, children who don't have access to the county school. She's asking whether I'd be willing to guarantee the first year's lease. He set the correspondence down. "She's not asking for a gift. She wants a formal loan agreement with repayment terms," she drafted herself. Ruth looked at the window. "She's coming back," Ruth said. "Not a question." "She's coming back," Gideon said. "On her own terms." Ruth picked up his empty coffee cup and walked to the door and stopped. "She gets that from her grandfather," she said. "He never went anywhere he hadn't decided to go." She walked out. Gideon looked at the proposal on his desk, 4 pages. Densely written, with projected student enrollment, budget breakdowns, and a repayment schedule organized by quarter. He had read it 3 times. He had found no errors. He picked up his pen and wrote, "Terms accepted. See you in September." The reply he got back was 2 words, "Thank you." He knew her well enough by now to understand that from Becca Hale, 2 words like that were a paragraph. September arrived. Caleb had told himself he was not going to watch the road. He watched the road. He told himself this was normal behavior for a man who had been corresponding with someone for 7 months and was expecting their return. It was normal. He was not going to make it into something it wasn't. He had work to do, and he did it, and he did not look at the road every time he heard wheels on gravel. He looked at the road every time he heard wheels on gravel. Ruth came out of the cottage at 2:30 and stood at the gate with her hands folded and her good coat on, which was the second time she'd worn it since February. Cole drifted out of the barn for no reason that he mentioned. Denny found something to repair near the front rail. Marsh, the temporary bookkeeper, appeared on the porch and stood there with his hat in his hands, in the exact posture of a man who had been told repeatedly that his filing system needed improvement and was hoping the person who would be assessing it had had a good journey. The wagon came through the gate at 3 o'clock. Becca was driving it herself. She was wearing the gray wool dress and a coat he hadn't seen before, darker, better cut, the coat of a person who had acquired it for a purpose and chosen it carefully. Her hair was pinned differently than he remembered, neater and more deliberate. She sat straight on the wagon bench, with the reins easy in her hands, and she looked at Red Willow Ranch coming into full view around her. And something happened in her expression that wasn't quite a smile. It was the thing underneath a smile. The recognition of a place that has been inside your chest the whole time you were somewhere else. She pulled the horse to a stop. She looked at the people standing in the yard. She looked at Caleb. He walked to the wagon. He didn't run. He was not a man who ran toward things, but he walked with a directness that covered the distance quickly, and he was at the wagon side before she had finished wrapping the reins. "You're late," he said. "The road through the pass had a bad section," she said. "I had to go around." "You should have written," I wrote. "The letter would have arrived after I did." He looked up at her on the wagon bench. She looked down at him. 7 months of letters and the January road, and I'll be here and the certain thing. All of it, sitting between them in the September afternoon. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He put his hand up. She took it and stepped down from the wagon, and when her feet were on the ground, she was close enough that he could see the changes, the steadiness in her that had always been there but was now something different. Settled rather than braced. The confidence of a person who had gone somewhere difficult and come back knowing they'd been right to go. "You look different," he said. "I'm not," she said. "I'm the same. I know," he said. "That's what's different." She looked at him for a moment with the gray-blue eyes that were her grandfather's eyes and her own eyes and nobody else's. Then Ruth was there, and the moment opened to include her. And Becca turned and put her arms around her mother, and Ruth held on, with the particular fierceness of a woman who doesn't show things easily and had been waiting 7 months for this and was not going to pretend otherwise. "You're thinner," Ruth said. "I'm not." "You are." "They didn't feed you properly." "They fed me perfectly well." Becca pulled back and looked at her mother's face, the color in it. The steadiness, the absence of the gray exhaustion that had lived under her skin all last winter. "You look well." "I am well," Ruth said. "I've been telling you that in every letter." "You tell me what you want me to hear," Becca said. "Your face tells me the rest." Ruth made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You sound like your grandfather." "Good," Becca said. Gideon came off the porch. He walked across the yard with the slight limp that always worsened in late summer when the heat had been heavy and the work had been long. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with the expression she'd first seen on him in the courthouse corridor, not triumph, but the heavier and more honest thing that lives on the other side of a long reckoning. "Miss Hale." "Gideon," she said. He put out his hand. She shook it. "The proposal," he said, "the building lease." "The papers are in the trunk," she said. "I had a solicitor in Helena review the repayment terms. He suggested one adjustment to the quarterly schedule that I think is reasonable. I'd like to go over it with you this week." "Tomorrow morning," he said. "My office. 7:30, she said. "I have a meeting with the building owner at 10. He looked at her for a moment. 7:30, he agreed. She nodded. Then she looked at him more directly, the way she looked at things that mattered and that she had been building toward saying for a long time. "The workers' families," she said. "The hands with daughters. Some of them have asked me already. Word got out about the school before I even arrived. I want to make sure you know that any child on this ranch's payroll, any age, any background, is welcome in my classroom without fee." Gideon looked at her. "The loan repayment covers the building," she said. "The teaching I do because that's what teachers do." "That's not a sustainable arrangement," he said. "You'll need income. I have the county school board application filed. If it goes through, there's a salary attached." She met his eyes. "If it doesn't go through, I'll find another way. I'm not asking you to solve that problem. I'm telling you the terms under which I'm operating so you understand what you're supporting." He was quiet for a moment. "You negotiated your own loan terms, arranged your own building, filed your own county application, and traveled back from Helena on a road with a bad pass without writing to anyone," he said. "Yes," she said. and you've been back for approximately 8 minutes. 7, she said. I'm efficient. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quiet, something she hadn't expected. Amos would have liked you enormously. She looked at him. He knew his own worth, Gideon said, and he never spent a minute waiting for someone else to confirm it. He held her eyes. I spent 35 years trying to repay what he did for me. I understand now that the debt doesn't travel that way. It travels forward. He glanced at the ranch around them, the yard, the barn, the workers at the gate, the cottage at the far edge where the curtain moved in the kitchen window. You showed me that. She held his gaze. Help people because they're worth helping, she said. Not because you owe the dead. That's what I said to myself after you told me, he said. Every morning since October. She nodded once. Complete. Then she turned to Caleb and said, help me with the trunk. He helped her with the trunk. They carried it together to the cottage, because she was staying with Ruth through October while the school building was prepared. And on the way across the yard, she told him about the county school board application and the 3 families in Dry Creek who had already committed their daughters and the 2 immigrant families from the mining operation south of town who had asked her, through a neighbor who spoke some English, whether their children were truly welcome. What did you tell them? Caleb said. I told them yes, she said. And then I went and learned 15 words of German so I could tell them directly. He stopped walking. She kept going for 2 steps before she realized and turned. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, the one he rarely showed, because he was a careful man. But when it appeared, it was entirely unguarded, the one that meant she had done something that reached past his defenses, before he'd thought to raise them. 15 words, he said. I'm working on more, she said. It takes time. He picked up his end of the trunk again, and they kept walking. There's something I want to ask you, he said, when you're settled. When the school is open and you've had a chance to see how things stand. I want to ask you something then. She looked at him over the trunk. Ask me now, she said. It'll keep, he said. I want to ask it right. She looked at him for a long moment with those direct gray-blue eyes. All right, she said, but don't wait too long, I'm not patient. I know, he said. That's one of the things I want to ask you about. She laughed. It was short and genuine, and it surprised her the way the best things often did. They carried the trunk inside. October came with the particular sharpness of a Montana autumn that means business. And the school opened on the 4th day of the month. Becca had spent 2 weeks preparing the building, with help she hadn't asked for and couldn't have refused. Cole showed up the first morning with 3 other hands and a box of tools. And by the time she'd recovered from her surprise, they'd already started on the shelving. Ruth came in the afternoons and managed the supply side with the same organized efficiency she brought to everything. Gideon sent lumber without comment. Caleb showed up at dawn on the last Saturday before opening and built 2 additional student benches from scratch because the enrollment had grown beyond the original projection, and she'd mentioned it once, in passing, and he'd apparently been listening. She hadn't asked him to. She told him that. I know, he said, setting the second bench in place. I was there. I remember not being asked. She looked at the bench. Thank you, she said. You're welcome, he said. That's how it works. She looked at him. That's what I've been trying to tell you for a year, he said. Not everything given is charity. Some of it is just people who care about what you're doing and want to see it succeed. He met her eyes. Let it be what it is. She was quiet for a moment. I'm working on it, she said. I know, he said. You're efficient. You'll figure it out. Opening day was 23 students. Ranch workers' daughters in worn boots. 2 immigrant girls who came with their father, who stood at the back of the room with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has wanted something for his children for a long time, and is not entirely sure he is permitted to want it. 3 older girls from Dry Creek who had been turned away from the county school for reasons that had more to do with their family's circumstances than their abilities. Becca stood at the front of the room. She looked at 23 faces looking back at her. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Miss Hale. We're going to begin with numbers. Because numbers are the language that nobody can take away from you once you know it." She picked up the chalk. "By the end of this month, every person in this room is going to be able to balance a household account. By the end of this year, you'll be able to catch an error in a contract before you sign it." She looked at them steadily. "That matters. It matters every day of your life. Let's start." She wrote the first number on the board. 23 students picked up their pencils. The father at the back of the room let out one long breath that he'd apparently been holding since before he walked in. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening after the last student had gone home, Caleb came to the school. He knocked, which he didn't need to do but did anyway. And she called, "Come in," and he came in with his hat in his hands and the particular expression of a man, and it said something and arrived at the moment of it. She was erasing the board. She stopped. She turned around. He looked at her, the chalk dust on her hands, the gray dress, the precise hair coming slightly loose at the end of a teaching day. The woman who had stood in a dark kitchen bleeding from cracked hands and decided that whatever was coming next, she was going to face it upright. "I said I wanted to ask you something when the school was open," he said. "You did," she said. "The school is open, it is." He turned his hat in his hands once. Just once. Then he set it on the nearest student bench and looked at her without it. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said. "You know how I feel. I've told you how I feel. I wrote it in approximately 30 letters and said it out loud on a January road, and I think we've both known for a while how this goes." He paused. "But I want to ask properly, because you deserve to be asked properly." She stood at the front of the classroom with chalk dust on her hands and waited. "Will you marry me?" he said. The room was quiet. "I want to know," he said. Because he was Caleb Voss, and he finished what he started. "Whether your future has room for me in it." She looked at him for a long moment. "It always did," she said. "I just needed to know that you wouldn't ask me to trade it for yours." "I was hoping," he said, "we'd build one." She crossed the classroom floor, and when she reached him, she put her chalk-dusty hands on either side of his face and looked at him with those direct gray-blue eyes that had never once looked at anything they weren't willing to see. "Yes," she said, "that's my answer. Yes." He put his hands over hers. They stayed like that in the empty classroom, while the Montana evening came down outside, and the school smelled of chalk and fresh wood and the particular possibility of a thing that has been built to last. It was 3 in the morning in mid-November when Gideon Mercer woke to a sound from the kitchen. He was out of bed before he was fully awake, the old soldier's reflex. The one that never left, regardless of how many years of peace came after. He found his robe and his lamp and came down the stairs with the careful speed of a man who had learned long ago that surprises in the night were best met moving forward rather than standing still. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. The stove was burning. The lamp on the preparation table was lit, and the sound he'd heard, the rhythmic, steady sound that had pulled him from sleep, was the sound of dough being worked in the large bread trough. For one single suspended second, his heart did something complicated in his chest. Then he looked properly. It was Becca. She was wearing an apron over her dress, and her hair was pinned up, and she was working dough in the trough with the same efficient, practiced rhythm he had first seen 14 months ago. But nothing else was the same. Her hands were not bleeding. Her dress was not worn through at the elbows. Her shoulders were not carrying the particular set of a person who is alone and frightened and running out of time. Beside her, Ruth was sitting at the preparation table with a cup of tea and a household ledger open in front of her, talking about something in a low voice, and Becca was answering between strokes of the dough. And both of them were doing the ordinary, comfortable thing of two people who have been talking to each other their whole lives and have stopped needing to perform it for an audience. At the far end of the table, Caleb sat with his coffee and one of the student arithmetic exercises Becca had left out, reading through it with the mild, focused expression of a man who is interested in whatever his hands are near. Nobody was hiding. Nobody was frightened. Nobody was sacrificing a future to survive another week. Gideon stood in the doorway and nobody noticed him yet, and he was glad of that because he needed a moment to understand what he was seeing, which was not what he had walked into 14 months ago. The desperate, invisible labor of a woman trying to hold a collapsing situation together in the dark. This was something he didn't have a ready word for, because he had not seen enough of it in his life to have built the vocabulary. It was a home, not a building, not an arrangement. A home, the actual thing, the thing built out of people who have chosen each other and mean it and show up and stay. Becca looked up and saw him. She didn't apologize for being there. She didn't explain. She just looked at him with those gray-blue eyes and said, "The celebration bread for tomorrow. I wanted it right. Tomorrow," he said. Opening celebration the school. She turned back to the dough. "I always bake when I need to think. It helps." "I know," he said. He came in and sat at the table. Ruth slid the teapot toward him without being asked. Caleb nodded and went back to the arithmetic exercise. The stove burned and the dough worked and the lamp held steady. Gideon looked at the framed photograph on the shelf, the one he'd put there himself. 2 months after October, when he'd finally understood that the right place for Amos Hale's face was not in a drawer or a private drawer, but in the room where the work happened. Caleb had hung it level without comment. Ruth had dusted it every week since. Amos Hale looked out from the frame with his formal, living eyes. Gideon had spent 35 years believing he owed a dead man. He understood now what the debt actually was, not a thing to be repaid in a single gesture. Not money or gratitude or a name finally located in a county record. It was something that moved forward, not backward. It was what happened when one person went back through the smoke for another. And that other person survived long enough to see what surviving was actually for. And used it. Amos had saved one life. That life had decades building a ranch. A woman with Amos's eyes and his stubbornness and his refusal to give away the part of himself that knew his own worth had walked into ranch at 3 in the morning with bleeding hands and a leather satchel full of evidence and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself because it's too busy working. And now 23 children were learning arithmetic in a building near Dry Creek. And a man who had thought the human beings on his property were interchangeable had started learning their names. And a woman who had been invisible to the world that mattered was visible, now had made herself visible through the irrefutable language of competence and loyalty and the refusal to disappear. The bread dough made no sound when Becca's hands worked it. That was still the first thing. "It's going to be a good day tomorrow," Ruth said. To nobody in particular and to all of them. "Yes," Becca said. "The Jensen girl," Ruth said. "Clara, she'll be there?" "Front row," Becca said. "She's been asking every day this week. She's going to be something," Ruth said. "She already is," Becca said. "She just doesn't know it yet." Caleb looked up from the arithmetic exercise. He looked at Becca, at the flower on her wrists, and the certainty in her voice, and the way she said those words as though she'd been practicing them for the girl who needed to hear them for her whole life. He folded the exercise and set it down. "She will," he said. "She has a good teacher." Becca didn't look up from the dough. But she smiled. It started at one corner of her mouth and moved across her face slowly. The way real things move, not performed, not constructed. Not offered for anyone's benefit. Just there, quiet and full. The smile of a woman who has arrived somewhere she chose and knows she chose it and would choose it again. Gideon Mercer watched it happen and understood, finally and completely, what his old friend had meant. Amos Hale had saved one man's life on a Virginia field and told him to make it useful to somebody besides himself. Gideon had spent 40 years thinking useful meant cattle and contracts and an operation that ran like a machine. He had been wrong about almost all of it. Useful meant the woman needing bread at 3 in the morning was doing it because she wanted to, not because she had to. Useful meant the people who built the thing with you had somewhere safe to sleep and the knowledge that illness was not the same as worthlessness. Useful meant the children in that schoolroom on the 4th of October picking up their pencils because someone had decided they were worth teaching. Useful was a thing that kept moving. It didn't stop at one person or one ranch or one debt. It traveled forward. And the woman everyone had once overlooked, the plus-sized daughter of a sick housekeeper who had kneaded bread at 3 in the morning with bleeding hands and a leather satchel full of evidence and a photograph of a man who had gone back through. The smoke had become the person who showed a 64-year-old cattle baron what it actually meant to survive, something worth surviving. The bread baked. The morning came. The school opened its doors. And the story of Red Willow Ranch was never the same again, not because the land changed. Not because the cattle changed. Not because the money changed. But because the people in it finally understood that a life is not measured by what a person accumulates, but by how many other people are given a fair chance because that person was here. Becca Hale was here. That was enough. That was everything.